Hello, I'm David Zuratzi. I'm a game designer from Mexico, and today I'm going to talk about the problematic representation of the LATAM culture for the entertainment industry. So let's begin then with some advice. The first is that I'm going to use Mexico as an example because I'm from Mexico and it's easier to me to explain the multicultural phases of LATAM using my own experience as an example. So let's begin with talking about what is Latin America, because a lot of times we believe in the cultural regions as cultural monoliths, as if they are the same. And when I talk about Europe, all Europe is the same. Or when I talk about Latin America, every country is the same. Mexico is the same than Argentina, than Colombia, and that's not true. Why? Because, well, Latin America has a lot of immigrants in his story from several places, from Africa, from Asia, from Europe. We have our own native America uh, cultures. So let's talk about this. As I told you, I'm going to use Mexico as an example because it is easier and I have more data about my country. So let's begin that Mexico is not an ancient country. It's a country that have two, 200 years of existence, and the territory has changed in the last years, in the last hundred of years. And we have to understand that we have almost 70 different languages, official languages here in Mexico. 68 of those languages are from native indigenous people, and we also have the Spanish. Also, the migrations between the indigenous people from the south of Mexico, Central America, it means it has a phenomenon of not cultural interchange, but mobility. So sometimes we have more indigenous populations in south of Mexico than other years because they move into the Mexican territory. So we have to understand that just imagine a country where we have so many languages. It could be something similar to what happens in a lot of European countries, such as Spain, where they have their own native languages, uh, plus the Spanish. Also, Mexico is divided in 32 states, and these states are the same size of population and geographical size that an European country. Just by an example, the population on Oaxaca, the state, the territory where I came from, is the same one that the population of Finland. So just imagine to have so many countries inside of one country. Uh, this is something that we can see also in, for example, in the European Union or in the United States, where they have this weird construction of political interest. So, what does it means is that we have one big country made of 32 countries, but also, in the case, for example, of Oaxaca, we have this state uh, with the same population of Finland. It is divided by 8 regions, and in these regions, they have their own variations of their own language. So, what does it mean? It means that the cultural references that we have when we talk about Mexico uh, is that we have many Mexicos. You cannot draw it in some unique way. And the same goes for LATAM. You cannot think about the Hispanic culture or the Latin American culture because there are a lot of cultures. And the sad thing about this is that in the pop culture and in the internet culture, we reduce it to something very, very small. The Aztecs, the mariachis, and the tacos. So when you talk about Mexico, it's just about those things. And when you talk about Latam, probably it is it used to be represented by the mariachi culture, but that's a very small part of what is Mexico, and it has nothing in common with the rest of our region. Other thing that happens here that I want to talk about is um, this problematic thing of saying, hey, the Aztecs, the pre-Hispanic culture. Yes, the Aztecs were one of those populations, but the problem is that that population is still alive in some parts of Mexico City, and they still talk their native language, the Nahuatl, and they just live there. Um, in some other parts of Mexico, for example, in Tlaxcala, they have their own native populations. And for example, in some other parts, such as Oaxaca, we have like a, a lot of native populations, such as the Zapotecas, Mixtecas. The Mayan population south of Mexico is other part of what is alive. So those are not references like when we talk about the ancient Greek, when we say, well, that population of ancient Greeks were some population that we have descendants, but they are no longer here. Uh, but in the case of Mexico, no. When you make a game about Mayan culture or Aztec culture, you are making a game about people who is still living there in the same geographic space. They still have their own language, they still have their own religious, and they use internet and they have their being part of the modernity of the internet culture and the modernity of Mexico. So we have to learn how to deal with these situations, you know. For example, let's begin with the representations levels because we have to understand that there's different level of representations and understand how it works and how can we process this information is something very important in order to understand what we are doing. For example, in the first level, we have this part of the representation that is about the aesthetic. You know, when we like the aesthetic of something and we use that aesthetic and change that aesthetic and go to recreate that aesthetic. And I bring this example of a Spelunky because it's a great example. And I have to say it again. There is no a bad way or a good way of representations or a bad way or a good level of a go into the representations levels because it depends on the project what we have to do. But for example, here in Spelunky, they took these pieces of Mexican culture, like the pre-Hispanic symbols that we have here, uh, when we can see this representation. Also, we have these stereotypical representations of indigenous, Mexican indigenous, and of a more contemporary, more modern Mexican kind of mariachi. This is a representations that is used to work fine with, for example, if you are creating a new fantasy world, we are making parodies. Uh, this works, and it's something that is similar to make, say, for example, to say, for example, um, France and mimics, all that kinds of things. Um, in these representations, what you are saying is, hey, that's very interesting to have those representation, those aesthetics. Let's use those aesthetics. Uh, in the second level, we have, and here is when it becomes the part that is problematic. We have, for example, such things as Guacamole or the Tomb Raider games. This level of representation tries to go deeper, so it is not the first thing that we understand about the representation of that culture. In this case, for example, in Guacamole, la lucha libre, the wrestling, that is something that has a very interesting cultural relevance here in Mexico, is where they constructed. And then they use the Day of the Dead symbols, and they recreate this world. It is fine, it goes deeper, but here is the stereotypes. Why? Eh, La lucha libre, ante Day of the Dead, ante mariachis, and all those things are the creations and artificial culture creations that came from the last century, where after the Mexican Civil War, we want to uh, create a new historic and national identity. So, meanwhile, there was the Great Wars in Europe. Mexico recreates their culture about this around these symbols. The only problem is that these are stereotypes because, for example, la lucha libre is not something that goes from in the whole Mexico. It works in some cities of Mexico, as well as the football, soccer works in some places in Mexico, as well as the Day of the Dead is something that in some regions of Mexico it's celebrated, but in some other regions they don't have that imaginary, and they don't do that kind of things, and they don't understand, and they seem that like very far. I, that's problematic because you are thinking that you are representing one country while you are not representing that country. The other problematic representation that I use, for example, the Tomb Raider series, the reboot about the Mayan culture, is that, well, they use this stone calendar, they make some modifications, but the problem is that that stone calendar is from the Aztec Empire in the center of country, is not from the Mayan culture at the south of Mexico. And the difference in time is like 5 to 800 years between those cultures. It means that it is like bringing, for example, airplanes, combat airplanes to the medieval story. It's the same problem. When we are looking this stone calendar from the Aztec indigenous into a Mayan space. And I think the thing about this is that you are changing the story for most people here in Mexico and for the common people. uh, we don't study in so deep chance the pre-Hispanic history. We have some roots there, obviously, but that are not our only roots. And the construction of the idea of create like a monolithic culture, pre-Hispanic cultures, uh, with thousands and of years of different cultures in different places of talking about in a geographic way doesn't work to create these narratives because, for example, the people in the north of Mexico doesn't live in a rainforest. They doesn't have the some indigenous um, populations that are related to those gods. Their the indigenous populations in the north of Mexico, they are still alive. They are populations that make a resistance to the colonialism, and they live their ways, their lives in the way they want. Uh, so bringing all together just make misinformations around this and misconception of what it is these representations of cultures and is disrespectful for these cultures because they are not cultures from the past, far past, beyond our knowledge. No, they are cultures that are alive. They are people that live with us, and they are still creating a cultural performance and providing their own ways of life and their own ways to understand the world. Eh, so it is important when we do these representations to understand what it is and have a good research about it. The third level of these representations, I call it the empathetic representation, is when you truly understand the complexity of the culture and the context of uh, your narrative. For example, Despelote, it's a game, an Ecuadorian game, that to me is a great example about the possibilities of the video games to represent the culture. And it's a great game that talks about the Latin American experience. If you want to know what it is to grow up in LATAM, you should play this game. If it is about some kids that they want to go and they are living the experience of see the soccer World Cup in LATAM. As I told you, this game is from Ecuador. Everything happens in Quito, but it's a great representation because you understand what is the economic situations of the Latin American population. You understand what is the imaginary of a kid of LATAM. You understand what are the way of life that we have. I recommend a lot that you prove Despelote. It's awesome. Um, Also, I think, and because this happens a lot here in Mexico, more than in other countries. But for example, you could tell me, hey, talking about the stereotypes and the representations, I have seen a lot of Mexicans who makes fun about the taco culture and all those things. And yes, as I told you, Latam is a multicultural region, and in what happens is that if you are talking about the urban, with more economic privilege people in the region, you will see they have that stereotypical understanding of Mexico, of mariachis, of tacos, because uh, the money, the economic privilege makes the people like having a difference between the uh, white culture, uh, and they have like some international culture, a more American way of life. So they disconnect from the roots of the Mexican uh, uh, life culture, of the Mexican urban culture, of the Mexican um, roots and complexity. And that's something that I believe it happens in the whole world. The only thing is that you cannot have a, or you don't have to build your construction of what does it means to be Mexican, or what does it means to live in LATAM, thinking that someone who lives in a different economic context from the one of the main uh, uh, economic context in the region, it will be. And that's very, very important because now we are going to the advice sections. And how can you create a more empathetic uh, projects for the, for your video games? Uh, there's no magic formula, but you can do a research. And in particular, I recommend the ethnographic tools because these kind of ethnographies uh, help you a lot to understand what is happening in the country with the personal lives of the people around there. The other thing is to seek for diversity in your sources because a lot of times we say, hey, this university, this college, and this some researcher. Yes, but as I told you, in a very complex context, cultural context, when you just check one source of information, it's a very limited way to understand that complex reality. And in the same way, we have to build diverse teams. But let me be very, very specific with this. I'm talking about culturally and ideologically diversity. Because it doesn't matter if we came from different parts of the world. If we believe the world it works the same way, then we won't have the chance to have this exchange of ideas. And something that I can tell you from firsthand is that, for example, in with the team that I work with, we have some atheist people, we have very Catholic people, we have some people with a, another cultural backgrounds. And it's very rich when we talk about something like how we understand the tragedy, how we understand uh, the morality, how we understand the ethics around some specific topics, because that let us understand the point of view of the other, of someone who thinks different from us. So it's better to have this diversity in terms of how do we construct our reality than ethnographic diversity, but everybody believes the same. And we have to foster the dialogue. We have to create spaces when we can dialogue and learn to listen to the others and understand the others. We don't have to believe or to act like the others because we have different contexts, but we have to understand why they are thinking what they are thinking. We have to understand how they are seeing the world. And well, that's all. In general, I hope this could be a brief introduction about this. And if you speak Spanish, I'm going to upload a similar video uh, on my YouTube channel. So if you want to follow the information about what we are doing here in Mexico with We Love Games, you can email me to my We Love Games email in order to make some collaborations. And if you want to follow the events, the courses, and what we are doing here in Mexico, you can follow us on Instagram in for layout. That is the brand that we are using here in LATAM to promote our events. I have to thank to the organizations, thank to Natasha for doing this, thank to all the community in Finland, and I hope we could have a lot of um, collaborations for the next year. I wish you the best. See you soon.